My name is Claire Donovan. I'm 41 years old. 6 weeks ago, I sat in a small conference room above a hardware store in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, while a lawyer named Mr. Pemberton read my next-door neighbors will out loud to a room full of people who hadn't visited him in over a year. I wasn't expecting to be there for more than 10 minutes. I figured he'd left me his garden tools, maybe his late wife's recipe box, since I'd been the one using the kitchen most these last few years anyway. Something small. Something that said, "Thank you for the soup." I did not expect to inherit his house. Before I take you there, if stories like this one matter to you, please like and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I read every one. Now let me take you back to the beginning. 6 years ago, my marriage ended, not dramatically, just the slow kind of ending where two people quietly stop being a team and one day notice they've been roommates for a while. Brian and I sold the townhouse, split things fairly, no kids involved, and I used my half to buy a small 2-bedroom house on Linden Street in Carlisle, a few blocks from the bakery I'd just taken over. The bakery is called Maple and Crumb. It had been a tiny, struggling place called Hestetter's Bake Shop for almost 40 years before that, run by a couple who were ready to retire, and I'd worked there part-time all through my 20s while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. When they offered to sell it to me, owner financing, slow and reasonable, it felt like the first genuinely good decision I'd made in years. I kept most of their recipes, added some of my own, and settled into a life that was smaller than the one I'd planned at 25, but felt more like mine than anything had in a long time. The house on Linden Street had a narrow side yard separating it from the house next door, a tidy single-story place with green shutters and a porch that ran the whole width of the front. An older man lived there alone. The first week I moved in, before I'd even met him properly, I came home to find my trash cans had blown over in a storm and someone had already set them upright and weighted the lids down with bricks. I found out later that was just Walter. That was sort of his whole personality, distilled into one gesture, before I even knew his name. Walter Kowalski was 81 when I moved in next door. He taught shop class, woodworking, small engine repair, that kind of thing at the high school for 34 years before he retired, and you could tell. Everything around his house was fixed, leveled, oiled, maintained in a way that made my house look, by comparison, like it was actively falling apart out of spite. His wife, Eleanor, had died about 2 years before I moved in. He didn't talk about her much at first, just little things. A rosebush by the porch steps that he bobbied obsessively and never explained why, until one day he mentioned, almost offhand, that Eleanor had planted it the year they bought the house, in 1974. After that, I understood the rosebush a lot better. For the first year or so, we were just neighbors in the normal sense. He'd wave from the porch. I'd wave back. Once, early on, my car wouldn't start on a freezing morning and I was standing in the driveway in my work clothes, close to tears because I had a wedding cake order due in 90 minutes, and Walter came out in his robe, took one look under the hood and said, "Battery terminals corroded, give me 5 minutes." He had it running before I'd even finished explaining what was wrong. I brought him a loaf of bread that afternoon as a thank you. He acted like I'd handed him a winning lottery ticket. That was sort of how it started. Small trades, bread for battery terminals, a jar of soup for him noticing my gutter was sagging and mentioning it before it became a real problem. Nothing that felt, at the time, like the beginning of anything except a nice arrangement between neighbors. I should say a little about my own life around that time, because I think it matters for understanding how this all happened so gradually. After the divorce, I was, frankly, exhausted in a way that took me a long time to recognize as exhausted, because nothing dramatic had happened. Brian and I hadn't fought, hadn't betrayed each other. We'd just worn each other down over a decade until there wasn't much left. I didn't have kids. Most of my friends from that chapter of my life were couple friends who quietly drifted toward Brian, the way these things go, not out of malice, just logistics. My parents had retired to Florida a few years earlier and called every couple of weeks, but they were 3 states away and busy building a life of their own. So when I say Walter and I became close, I don't want to make it sound like I was some lonely, desperate person who latched onto an elderly neighbor because I had nothing else going on. I had the bakery, which took up most of my waking hours, and I had a handful of good friends I saw regularly. But I also had a lot of evenings with nothing scheduled, and a lot of weekends that could have gone either way. Walter, I think, was in a similar position, just at a different stage of life. He had a leaner's absence, and he had Gary's family 2.5 hours away, and he had a string of ordinary days that nobody in particular was filling. 2 people with empty evenings, living 20 feet apart, are going to find each other eventually. That's really all it was at the start. If you've ever had a relationship with someone that started small and just kept going year after year, until one day you realized it had quietly become one of the most important relationships in your life, drop a comment and tell me who that was for you. I want to know I'm not the only one. About 1.5 years after I moved in, on a Sunday evening in early fall, I was sitting on my own porch steps with a cup of tea and the Sunday paper, working half-heartedly on the crossword, when Walter came out onto his porch with his own cup of coffee and asked, across the side yard, whether I'd gotten 17 down yet. I hadn't. He had instantly, without even looking at the paper. He did the crossword every single Sunday, had for decades, originally with a leaner. I got up, walked across the side yard, and sat down on the other end of his porch swing, and we finished that crossword together in about 20 minutes. The next Sunday, I brought my coffee over before he even came outside. The Sunday after that, it was just understood. For the next several years, every single Sunday evening, with maybe a dozen exceptions for genuine emergencies on either side, Walter and I sat on that porch swing and did the crossword together. Sometimes we talked about other things. Often we didn't talk much at all. It became, without either of us ever deciding it on purpose, the steadiest appointment in my week. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this because it's some grand romantic thing, or because I was lonely and he filled some enormous gap. I had friends, I had my work, my life was fine. It's just that somewhere in there, Walter went from the neighbor to someone whose porch light I checked for every evening, almost without thinking about it, the way you'd check on a family member's car in the driveway. The crossword nights weren't the only thing either, just the most regular one. Walter started showing up at the bakery sometimes, on weekday mornings, and he became something of a fixture there. He'd take the same corner table by the window, order the same black coffee and a cinnamon roll, and read the newspaper for an hour while my staff and regular customers got to know him. My assistant manager, a college kid named Ravi, used to argue with him good-naturedly about sports for 10 minutes most mornings. One of my regulars, an older woman named Phyllis, started saving Walter the crossword section from her own paper because she finished hers faster than he got through his. Without either of us planning it, Walter became part of the bakery's daily rhythm, the way certain customers do, not an employee, not quite a friend of any one person, just a fixture everyone was fond of. For my part, I started doing little things without really thinking of them as anything. I'd drop off a container of soup if I knew he'd had a doctor's appointment that day. I picked up his prescriptions when I was already at the pharmacy for my own. When his ancient television finally gave out, I drove him to the electronics store and helped him pick out a new one, then came back that evening to help him figure out the remote, which took considerably longer than either of us expected and ended with both of us laughing so hard at the absurdity of modern television menus that Walter had to put his coffee down. None of these things on their own were a big deal. That's sort of the point. None of them ever felt like caregiving while they were happening. They felt like what you do for anyone you liked who happened to need a hand, the same way Walter had once come out in his bathrobe to fix my car battery. It only adds up to something larger when you look back at 5 years of it all at once, which, at the time, neither of us was doing. Walter had one son, Gary, who lived in Wilmington, Delaware, about 2.5 hours away, with his wife Denise and their 2 kids, Tyler and Madison, who were teenagers when I first moved in and in their 20s by the time all of this happened. I want to be careful here because I know how these stories usually go, and I don't think Gary is a villain. I think he's something much more ordinary than that, which in some ways is harder to talk about. Gary called his dad most Sundays, not our Sunday, a different time, usually mid-afternoon, for what Walter affectionately called the check-in call. 15, 20 minutes. How's the weather? How's the knee? Anything new? Gary and his family came up for Christmas most years, and sometimes for a long weekend in the summer. On paper, that's not nothing. A lot of adult kids do less. But I lived 20 feet away, and I saw the difference between not nothing and showing up. I was there when Walter's hip started bothering him badly enough that he stopped trusting himself on stairs 2 winters before he died, and started sleeping in the downstairs den instead of his bedroom. A decision he made quietly by himself and didn't mention to Gary for almost a month because, as he put it to me, he'll just worry, and there's nothing he can do about it from Wilmington anyway. I was the one who took him to the orthopedist. I was the one in the waiting room when they scheduled the hip replacement. When I asked him if Gary was coming up for the surgery, Walter got a little quiet and said, "He offered. I told him not to bother, Denise has that work thing, and it's just a couple days in the hospital, I'll be fine." I drove him to the hospital at 5 in the morning. I picked him up 2 days later. I was the one who rearranged the den so he could manage the recliner, who picked up his prescriptions, who came by twice a day for the first 2 weeks to make sure he was eating and not falling. Gary called every day during that stretch. I know because I was usually in the room when the phone rang, and Walter would put on a brighter voice, not fake exactly, just curated. "Oh, I'm doing great, Claire's been a huge help, don't worry about me." And Gary, every time, would say some version of, "That's so good to hear, Dad. Glad Claire's there." Relieved. Genuinely relieved, I think. And then the conversation would move on to something else. There was a similar pattern around the holidays, too, though it took me longer to notice it because each individual instance had a perfectly reasonable explanation. The Thanksgiving after Walter's hip surgery, Gary called a few days ahead to say that Denise's parents were having some kind of health scare of their own, and they needed to go down to Maryland instead, and they were so sorry. and could they do an early Christmas visit instead to make up for it? Walter said, of course, don't even think about it, and meant it. That Thanksgiving, I'd already planned to spend the day with my own parents over video call and then have a quiet day to myself. The bakery's busiest stretch of the year was right around the corner, and I was looking forward to the rest. But around 2 in the afternoon, I texted Walter to ask what he was doing for dinner, mostly out of habit, and he wrote back, "Frozen turkey dinner, the small kind. Don't worry about me, go enjoy your day." I went over anyway. I brought a real turkey breast I'd been planning to portion out for the week, plus stuffing and green beans I threw together in about 40 minutes. And we ate at his kitchen table and watched the back half of the parade on his old TV before switching to football, which neither of us cared about but which felt like the right kind of background noise. It became, without either of us saying so, just what we did on Thanksgiving from then on, small, quiet, the two of us, while his actual family's early Christmas visit sometimes happened and sometimes got pushed again to right after the new year, which sometimes happened and sometimes didn't. I want to be fair here because I keep coming back to this. None of these individual cancellations were unreasonable. People's parents do have health scares. Work schedules do get complicated around holidays. If you'd asked Gary, in any given year, why that particular Thanksgiving or that particular weekend hadn't worked out, he'd have had a perfectly good answer, and it would have been true. It's just that perfectly good answers, stacked up over 5 or 6 years, started to form a shape. And the shape was that Walter's holidays belonged to whoever happened to be free, and increasingly, that was me. I think that's the part that's hardest to explain to people who weren't there. It wasn't that Gary didn't care. I really believe he did, in the abstract, the way you care about a parent you grew up with and love and assume will always just sort of be okay because they always have been. It's that Claire's there became, over years, a kind of permission slip. A reason not to worry, which slowly, without anyone deciding it on purpose, became a reason not to call as often, not to visit as often, not to ask the harder follow-up questions. Because the answer was always going to be, "I'm fine," Claire's been a huge help. Walter's 80th birthday was the clearest example. Denise had planned a whole weekend trip up to Carlisle months in advance. A real celebration, the kind of thing Walter had been quietly looking forward to for weeks, mentioning it to me on our Sunday porch nights. Then, about 10 days before, Tyler's travel soccer team made it to some regional tournament with a conflicting schedule, and the whole trip got rescheduled to, sometime this fall, we'll figure out a date. Walter told me about it on a Tuesday, very evenly, very matter of fact, the way he told me most things that actually bothered him. I didn't say anything to Gary or Denise. It wasn't my place, and honestly, I don't think it would have changed anything even if I had. What I did instead was bake Walter a cake. His favorite, a yellow cake with that old-fashioned cooked chocolate frosting that nobody makes anymore because it takes forever. And on the actual night of his birthday, a Thursday, I brought it over with 2 candles because that's all I had in the drawer, and we sat on the porch swing even though it wasn't Sunday, and did a crossword from earlier in the week that neither of us had finished, and he blew out the candles and said, "This is plenty, Claire. This is more than plenty." The fall visit happened in late October. They stayed one night. If someone in your life has ever made you feel like the easy option, the reliable one who never asks for anything, and you've wondered whether that reliability was ever actually appreciated or just relied on, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. I think more people carry this than ever say it out loud. The last year of Walter's life, things slowed down in the way they do. Nothing dramatic, no single crisis, just a gradual narrowing. He stopped driving entirely that spring after a close call pulling out of the grocery store parking lot that scared him enough to hand me his keys the next day and ask if I'd just take him from now on. He started napping in the afternoons, which he'd never done before. He lost some weight he didn't have to lose. His doctor used the word frailty at one appointment, gently, the way doctors do when they're trying to prepare you for something without saying it outright. Our Sunday crosswords kept going. If anything, they became more important, sometimes the only real conversation either of us had all week. He started telling me more stories during that last year. About a leaner. About teaching shop class for 3 decades and the kids who came back, years later, to tell him they'd built a career out of something he'd taught them. About a 1967 Ford Mustang he and a leaner's brother had restored together in the 70s, sitting under a cover in his garage that he hadn't started in years but couldn't bring himself to sell. Gary called every Sunday afternoon like always, visited for Christmas like always. At Christmas that last year, I remember Walter mentioning, almost as an aside while we were doing dishes after I'd brought over a casserole for everyone, that Gary had said something like, "Dad, you're looking a little thin, you eating okay?" And Walter had said, "Claire's been feeding me plenty, don't you worry." And Gary had nodded, satisfied, and the conversation moved on to whether the Eagles were going to make the playoffs. That same Christmas visit, I remember Madison asking Walter, almost in passing, what he'd been up to lately, and Walter mentioning the Sunday crosswords. Claire and I have been doing the puzzle together every week, must be 5 years now. Madison had laughed in a kind way and said, "That's so cute, Grandpa," and then asked Tyler something about his apartment lease, and the conversation moved on. I remember it specifically because Walter brought it up to me afterward on the porch, a little wistfully, not hurt, exactly, just observing it. "Funny," he said, 5 years of Sundays and it's cute." I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it differently now. By that final winter, I'd started staying later most evenings, not because anything was urgently wrong, but because Walter had gotten quieter in a way that worried me more than any specific symptom did. He slept more. He repeated a few stories he'd already told me, which he'd never done before, and once or twice he seemed to lose the thread of what he was saying mid-sentence and just sort of let it go with a small laugh. "Ah, never mind, it wasn't important." I mentioned it to his doctor at one of our appointments, framed carefully as "I've just noticed he seems more tired than usual." And the doctor nodded in a way that told me she'd noticed too, and adjusted one of his medications, and used that word again, frailty, a little more directly this time. I didn't call Gary about any of this. In hindsight, maybe I should have. At the time, it didn't feel like there was anything specific enough to report. No diagnosis, no event, just the slow accumulation of small changes that anyone living with someone day to day notices long before it becomes a phone call. I told myself I'd mention it at Christmas, in person, where it would be easier to explain. Walter died about 6 weeks before that Christmas. I don't think Gary was lying to himself on purpose. I think "Claire's been feeding me plenty" was, by that point, just the answer he expected and needed, and he heard it and felt the worry lift, the way you do when a smoke detector finally stops beeping. He had no real way of knowing that "Claire's been feeding me plenty" meant I was over there most days, that I'd started doing his laundry because the basement stairs had become too much, that I'd quietly taken over refilling his pill organizer because he kept losing track of which day it was. Walter died on a Tuesday morning in March in his sleep, in the recliner in the den where he'd been sleeping for almost 2 years. I know it was peaceful, or as peaceful as these things can be. There was a half-finished crossword on the side table from the night before, his reading glasses folded on top of it, a mug of tea gone cold beside it. I found him because I always brought him coffee on Tuesday mornings. Had for years, it was just part of the rhythm, the way the Sunday crossword was. I knocked, let myself in with the spare key he'd given me ages ago for exactly this kind of situation, and I knew within about 3 seconds of walking into that den. I sat with him for a while before I called anyone. I'm not sure how long. Long enough that the coffee I'd brought went cold too. I called 911 first, because that's what you're supposed to do, even when you already know. And then I called Gary. I want to talk about the days after, because I think this is the part that surprised me the most, even though, looking back, maybe it shouldn't have. Gary and Denise drove up that same afternoon. Tyler and Madison came up the next day, having driven through the night from college and from a job in Philadelphia, respectively. By the time of the funeral, 3 days later, there was a whole production, is maybe the word. Denise cried audibly throughout most of the service, in a way that genuinely seemed to surprise some of the older neighbors who'd lived on Linden Street for decades and had maybe seen Denise 4 times total. Tyler gave a short, visibly emotional reading. Madison posted something on Instagram that night, a photo of Walter from a few Christmases ago, captioned something about the sweetest, kindest grandpa. I'm going to miss him every single day. Rest easy, pop pop, broken heart. Which I only saw because one of my own friends, who didn't know the family, sent it to me afterward saying, "This is so sad, were you close with him too?" I'm not going to sit here and tell you grief isn't real, or that Gary and Denise and the kids didn't genuinely feel something at that funeral. I think they did. I think it's entirely possible to love someone, in the abstract, your whole life, and also to have shown up for them so rarely, in the specific, that the gap between those two things only becomes visible once it's too late to close. I don't think that makes the grief fake. I think it just makes it complicated, and I think most people don't like sitting with complicated, so they round it up to something simpler and louder instead. What I noticed mostly was how often people at that funeral came up to me, neighbors, a few of Walter's old students, even the pastor, and said some version of, "You were so good to him, Claire. He talked about you all the time." And how, each time that happened, I'd catch Denise, a few feet away, hearing it too, with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time. I understand it a lot better now. One moment from that day has stayed with me more than almost anything else. During the reception afterward, held in the church's fellowship hall with the usual spread of casseroles and sheet cake, one of Walter's former students, a man in his 50s now, who'd driven up from Hagerstown when he saw the obituary, came over and introduced himself to me specifically, not to the family. He said he'd been a difficult kid in high school, the kind of kid teachers tended to give up on, and that Mr. Kowalski had been the only adult at that school who ever treated him like he was capable of building something with his hands that actually worked. He said he'd gone on to run his own cabinetry business for almost 30 years because of that one class. Then he said, "I saw the obituary mentioned a devoted neighbor." I figured that meant somebody who waved at him from the driveway, but Philly's over there. He nodded toward my regular from the bakery, who'd come to pay her respects, told me you used to bring him coffee every morning and do the crossword with him every Sunday for years. That's not a neighbor. That's family, the kind some people are lucky enough to find outside the family they were born into. He shook my hand and went to get a piece of cake, and I stood there for a minute, not sure what to do with what he'd just said. While across the room, Denise was telling someone about a trip she and Walter had taken to the Poconos years and years ago, gesturing warmly, completely sincerely, as though it had happened last summer instead of, as I happen to know, sometime in the early 2000s. I'm not bringing this up to make Denise look bad. I think she genuinely loved her father-in-law, in whatever way people love family members they don't see often. A kind of love built mostly out of memory and good intentions, refreshed only occasionally, like a houseplant that survives on infrequent watering because it's hardy, not because anyone's paying close attention. It can be real and still be thin. I think that's the part I didn't have words for until much later. Only 3% of people who watch a video like this one actually subscribe. If this story is hitting close to home, take a second and tap that button, it really does help. Okay, let's get into the will reading. About 2 weeks after the funeral, Mr. Pemberton's office called and asked if I could come in for the reading of the will, along with Gary, Denise, Tyler, and Madison. I almost didn't go. I genuinely thought it was a courtesy thing. Maybe Walter had left me a small keepsake and wanted it handled formally, or maybe they just needed me there to sign something related to the spare key and some paperwork about the house being unoccupied. I told the woman on the phone as much. She just said, gently, "Mr. Pemberton would really like you there, Ms. Donovan. It won't take long." The conference room was small, above a hardware store downtown. Pemberton had been Walter's lawyer for almost 40 years and worked out of the same building the whole time. Gary, Denise, Tyler, and Madison were already there when I arrived, all dressed a little more formally than I was in my work clothes, since I'd come straight from the bakery. There was a moment when I walked in where I could see all 4 of them doing a quick, polite recalculation of why I was there. And then, just as quickly, deciding it didn't matter, because whatever it was, it surely wasn't going to affect them. Mr. Pemberton was kind and a little formal, the way lawyers of a certain generation are. He went through some preliminary things first, confirming everyone's identity, a brief explanation of how the reading would go. Then he opened a folder and started reading. The first part was mostly what everyone expected. Specific personal items named individually. To Madison, Elinor's jewelry, her wedding ring, a strand of pearls, a few other pieces, with the hope that she'll wear them and think of her grandmother, who would have liked her very much. To Tyler, the contents of the workshop, every tool, every piece of equipment, with the hope that he'll find some use for them, even if it's just one project, because 34 years of teaching shop class taught me that everybody's got at least one project in them, even if it takes them a while to find it. To Gary, the 1967 Mustang in the garage, plus a specific sum of money, $20,000. For Gary, who I know has always loved that car, even if neither of us ever got around to getting it running again. I remember thinking at that point that it was a sweet, thoughtful list. Personal. The kind of thing that takes real care to write. I was still expecting, at any moment, for Mr. Pemberton to say my name and hand me a recipe box. Then he turned the page and read. The remainder of my estate, including my home at 214 Linden Street, all contents not otherwise specified, and the balance of my savings and investment accounts, I leave to my neighbor and dear friend, Claire Donovan. The room went very quiet. I think my first reaction wasn't even shock. It was confusion, the kind where your brain just sort of refuses the sentence and waits for it to resolve into something that makes more sense. I actually said, out loud, "I'm sorry, what?" Mr. Pemberton very gently repeated it. The house. The remaining accounts, which, it turned out, were not small. Walter had been quietly disciplined with money his entire life, and between his pension, Elinor's old retirement accounts, and decades of not spending much, there was a little over $200,000, on top of a house that was fully paid off and worth, conservatively, around $240,000 more. Denise was the first to speak. "That can't be right," she said, not loudly, but in a tone that had gone instantly cold. "He has a son. He has grandchildren. You're telling me he left the house to the neighbor." Mr. Pemberton, to his credit, didn't flinch. "The will is quite clear, and quite recent. Walter updated it about 18 months ago, in this office, of sound mind, with 2 witnesses present. I'd be glad to walk you through the specifics, if that would help." What followed was about 20 minutes that I genuinely don't fully remember in order. Gary asked, more than once, whether the will could be challenged. Not aggressively, more like he was thinking out loud, the way you do when you're trying to find a door that might not be locked after all. Tyler asked, at one point, whether this meant he had to give the tools back if it turned out the will was invalid, which Mr. Pemberton answered very patiently. Madison didn't say much. She just looked at me, for a long moment, with an expression that I think was less anger than something closer to recalculation. The same recalculation from when I'd walked in, except this time it clearly did matter, and she was working through exactly how much. At some point, Denise said, to no one in particular but loud enough for everyone to hear, "She's not even family." And I understand why she said it. I do. From where she was sitting, that's exactly what it looked like, the neighbor, the nice lady who brought casseroles, walking away with the house Gary grew up visiting, the savings that should, by every normal expectation, belong to the next generation. I didn't say anything for a while. I wasn't trying to be dramatic about it. I genuinely didn't know what to say. Finally, I said, quietly, "I had no idea about any of this. I want you to know that. I never asked him for anything, and I never expected anything." Which was true. It just didn't change what was written down in front of all of us. Mr. Pemberton cleared his throat a little carefully and said, "There's one more thing. Walter left a letter for Claire, but he asked that it be read aloud here today. He was specific about that." The letter wasn't long. Mr. Pemberton read it in Walter's own handwriting, photocopied onto a single page, dated about 18 months earlier, right around the time I realized later that Gary had postponed the 80th birthday trip. "Dear Claire," it began, "if you're hearing this, it means I finally went and did it," and Pemberton actually read it out loud like I asked him to, which I'm sure made everyone in that room very uncomfortable, and I'm sorry about that, but not very sorry. A couple of people in the room actually laughed, briefly, despite everything. It was such a Walter thing to write. I want to explain myself, mostly for Gary's sake, because I think he deserves that, even if he doesn't agree with it. "Gary, I love you. I've loved you your whole life, and I loved your mother, and I know you love me too, in the way people love a parent they assume will just always be there until, one day, they aren't. That's not an accusation. That's just how it goes for most families, and I was probably the same way with my own father, so I don't get to be too high and mighty about it. Here's the thing, though. Somewhere along the way, I think I made it too easy for everyone, including myself, to believe I didn't need much. I didn't want to be a burden. I never wanted you driving up here in a panic over something small. So I learned to say I'm fine a lot because it was true enough most of the time, and because it made the phone calls shorter and easier for both of us. I think I'm fine. Claire's been a big help became a kind of password over the years. Say it, and the conversation could move on to something easier. What I didn't realize, until pretty recently, is that the password worked too well. It wasn't that you didn't care, Gary. It's that I'd accidentally given you permission not to look closer, and you took it, the way anyone would, because looking closer is hard and exhausting and scary, and not looking is so much easier when someone tells you it's okay not to. Claire never asked for that permission. She just kept showing up, every single day, for years, asking nothing in return, not even acknowledgement most of the time. I used to think about that a lot, lying in that recliner at night, that the difference between the people who love you and the people who show up for you isn't always the same difference. And when it isn't, I think the second one matters more, especially toward the end. So, Gary, the Mustang is yours, finally, after all these years of saying we'd get to it. Get it running. Take the kids for a drive in it. That's worth more to me than you'll know. Tyler, the workshop is yours. I know we've never been close, and that's on both of us, but I taught 34 years of kids how to use those tools, and I'd like to think one more might find something in there worth learning. Madison, your grandmother, would have loved watching you wear those pearls. She had a way of making everyone feel like the most important person in the room, and from what little I've seen of you, I think you might have that too, if you ever decide to use it. And Claire, the house, the money, all of it, please don't spend the next 10 years feeling guilty about this, because I will come back and haunt you, and you know I'm stubborn enough to figure out how. You gave me my last few years back when I could have just been a name on a Sunday phone call. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually. Use the money to do something with that bakery, or don't, or just have a life that doesn't keep you up at night the way I know money worries used to. You've earned a little bit of not worrying. Thank you for the crosswords. 17 down was always my favorite. Walter. Nobody said anything for a long moment after Mr. Pemberton finished reading. Denise had her hand over her mouth. Gary was staring at the table, and I could see his jaw working, the way people's do when they're trying very hard not to cry in front of other people. Tyler looked, for the first time since I'd walked in, genuinely young, like a kid, who'd just been handed something heavier than he expected. Madison was the one who eventually spoke. She looked at me and said quietly, "Did you know about the crosswords that he called it that, the password?" "No," I said. "I had no idea he felt like that. I thought he liked having someone to do the puzzle with." "He did," she said. "I remember him mentioning it, actually, like years ago. I think I said something like, 'That's cute, Grandpa,' and changed the subject." She looked down at the pearls Mr. Pemberton had set in front of her, still in their small velvet box, unopened. I don't think I ever asked him a single question about it, not once. The weeks after that were strange, and I won't pretend they were easy. Gary called me, about 4 days later, the first time he'd ever called me directly in 6 years of living next door to his father. He was a little stiff at first, a little formal, and at one point he said, "I'm not going to pretend I'm not still processing all of this. It's a lot." I told him I understood, and that I genuinely meant what I'd said in that office. I hadn't known, hadn't asked, hadn't expected any of it. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "I know. That's actually the part that's hardest, if I'm honest. If you'd asked for it, I think I'd know how to be angry. You didn't ask for any of it. You just were there for years. And I wasn't, and I think some part of me has known that for a long time and just never had to look at it directly until now." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "He talked about you a lot, mostly good things. He was proud of you, your job, the kids. He just missed you. I think that's all it ever was." A couple of weeks after that call, Gary asked if he could come up on his own without Denise or the kids to go through some of Dad's things, if that's okay. And honestly, I'd like to see the place. I haven't really just sat in that house in years, not without somewhere else to be after. He came up on a Saturday. I made coffee, and we sat in Walter's kitchen, and at some point he asked if I'd show him the workshop, since Tyler hadn't had a chance to really look through it yet and Gary wanted to see it before everything got boxed up and moved. I walked him through it, the pegboard of tools, each one labeled in Walter's careful block lettering, the half-finished birdhouse clamped in a vise that he'd apparently been working on and off, for months. Gary stood there for a long time, just looking around. Then he said, quietly, almost to himself, he used to have a workshop like this in our garage in Lancaster when I was a kid. I used to hang out in there with him on weekends, handing him things mostly. I wasn't much help. I haven't thought about that in probably 30 years. He picked up one of the tools, turned it over in his hands, and set it back down exactly where it had been. I don't even know when I stopped doing that. There wasn't a day it stopped, it just did. I told him that was sort of the thing I kept coming back to, too, that almost nothing in this whole story happened on a single day. It was all just an accumulation of ordinary Tuesdays in both directions. Gary nodded and didn't say anything for a while, and then he said, "For what it's worth, and I know this doesn't change anything, and I'm not saying it to make myself feel better, I'm glad it was you. I really am. I just wish I'd known sooner that it needed to be anyone." Before he left that day, he asked if I'd be willing to keep doing the Sunday crossword with him, sometimes over the phone, if nothing else, since he couldn't exactly drive up every week. I told him I'd like that. We've done it twice so far. He's not very good at it yet. Walter would have had opinions about that. It's been about a month and a half now. I haven't decided everything yet, what to do with the house, whether to sell my place on Linden Street and move into Walter's or rent his out or something else entirely. Mr. Pemberton says there's no rush, and for once in my life, I'm trying to actually believe that and not panic about it. One thing I have decided. I'm putting a chunk of the savings into the bakery. Not anything flashy. A second oven, finally, after years of working around one that's older than some of my employees, and enough cushion that I can afford to give my staff a real raise without lying awake about payroll. Walter used to ask, every so often, why I never expanded, and I always gave him some version of "it's not the right time," which was true in the way "I'm fine" was true for him, technically accurate, and also a way of not looking too closely at something. I think about that a lot now. I did go through some of the boxes in Walter's spare room a couple weeks ago, and I found dozens of old photo albums, decades of them, going back to the 60s. I called Gary and asked if he wanted them, all of them, no strings attached. He drove up that weekend with Denise and the kids, and we spent an afternoon going through boxes in Walter's living room, and at one point Tyler found a photo of Walter, maybe 30 years younger, standing in front of the workshop holding up something he'd built, grinning like a kid. Tyler asked if he could keep that one separately, in a frame. I told him of course. Madison wore the pearls that day. She didn't say anything about it, she just had them on. A few things have stuck with me since then, and I keep coming back to them. 1. Showing up isn't the same as caring, and caring isn't the same as showing up, and most people, including the people who love you most, will quietly choose whichever one is easier, unless something forces them not to. 2. Telling people I'm fine to spare them worry can be its own kind of quiet dishonesty, even when every individual word of it is true. 3. The relationships that change your life rarely announce themselves at the start. Mine started with a corroded battery terminal and a loaf of bread. 4. Grief and guilt can look identical from the outside, and sometimes even from the inside, and I don't think it's anyone's job to sort out which one someone else is feeling, especially right after a loss. 5. You don't get to choose what someone leaves you in any sense of that word, but you do get to choose what you do with it afterward, and I think that part might matter more than the inheritance itself. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me about a neighbor, a friend, or someone outside your family who became more like family than some of your actual family ever did. I read every one.